Good evening, everyone. Great to see you. Happy Valentine's Day. At least David is wearing red. I wasn't really feeling in a red mood. Anyway. Oh, and the red heart. Nice. I like it. All right. Well, thank you all for being here this evening. It's kind of a busy time for a lot of us. Hopefully we can kind of get through our conversations tonight and move on to the next steps. I think our first, actually, hold on. I also apologize if I'm still eating dinner. I ran in the house at like 6:57, so I'm trying to eat something really, really fast. All right, so I guess the first thing, well, and before we do that, as you know, the purpose of our meeting tonight is to begin reviewing the articles in the charter, as well as discuss some of the amendments that were in the resolution passed by the council. We will have the county auditor joining us later this evening towards the end of our meeting, because some of the items that are on our list actually affect the county auditor, so she's going to be with us for a little bit. But the first item of business is to approve our minutes from the January 24th meeting. So does anyone have any comments or questions or suggested changes for the minutes from January 24th? All right, I guess seeing none.
I'll make a motion to approve.
Right, thank you, Mr. Kaufman. Can I get a second?
Second.
Thank you, Larry. All in favor? Aye, or raise your hand. Aye.
Aye.
Great. All right, so our minutes are approved. Okay. So I guess we'll then jump right into the charter matters discussion. And as you know, we're going to be talking, as I already said, discussing articles 1, 2, and 3 this evening, and some of the things that fit into those. And I know Ms. Corby, I think, has pulled together a presentation to kind of walk us through some of these sections. I thought that might be helpful as we go through. And then when we get to the items from the resolution that we need to discuss, we can kind of pull those in at that time and discuss those items. I think the discussion on Article 1 should be pretty quick, because that's just very basic information. The charter is the name of the county and some very basic things, but maybe Ms. Corby, how about I'll turn it over to you to kind of start walking through some of that stuff.
So this is nothing fancy. I just created some slides here, and each slide highlights a portion of the charter that you will be discussing this evening. So I can keep this up on the screen as long as you find it helpful. If you just want to go through it and just take a look at each section. If someone wants to stop me, I can bring the presentation down and then you can engage in a discussion over the portion that is up on screen. So this is Article 1, as Ms. Mansfield mentioned. It addresses the name and rights of the county. It has 3 sections to it in total. It talks about how Anne Arundel County is its own body. Corporate, Ms. Blair Klassmeyer can certainly jump in here. We do even have a resident agent. The county attorney is the resident agent, so it's like a corporation almost in that sense. Section 102, pretty self-explanatory, exercise of powers. Section 103, the name and boundaries of Anne Arundel County. So these are just some very preliminary basic provisions in the charter that start us off. Does anybody want me to stop here for any discussion on any of these 3 sections? All right. So Article 2 is actually the County Council, and it begins with Section 201, which describes the composition of the County Council. Pretty self-explanatory. Once again, it says there shall be a county, 7 members. You have to there's a residency requirement. It talks about mode of election. Once again, pretty basic, self-explanatory. Anybody need me to stop on this slide? Okay.
Yeah, Ms. Corby, before, I know one of the items we have for discussion is about increasing the number of councilmanic districts, but maybe you could just go through the sections first, and then we can come back for that discussion.
Sure. Yep, I'm happy to do that. I'll just go through all of Article 2 briefly, okay? And then if it helps to bring something up on screen, you just let me know.
Yep, that sounds good.
Okay. So here we have section 201, we just went over. Come on, there we go. Section 202, qualifications. Section 203 is term of office. I think there have been some questions about terms for council members, so this probably is one that you want to flag. Section 204, compensation. I know there were some questions about compensation. I believe you took that off of your overall plan for discussion at the last meeting, however. But if you have any questions about compensation, section 204 is the one we want to come back to. Section 205 is describes vacancies. If there's a vacancy in the seat of a council member. Oops. Section 205, there we go. Section 205 is pretty long. Again, it pretty much addresses what it said. It addresses, there is some newer stuff that has been added to this particular section about council members who are a member of the armed forces and so on. That's a newer provision that was added in the past few years or past 10 years. Section 206, there's your districts. This is an original provision. I believe there was a commission member that had a question about this at the last meeting. This particular provision has been in the charter since 1964. It has not changed in that time. There is a chart that lays out the precincts that are in each district, and that is in the charter. We can bring that up specifically if you would like. Section 207. This is what just happened with the council in Bill 1522. They received your report and they enacted, through ordinance, they revised the districts a little bit. Section 208. This section will probably become pretty relevant in your conversation tonight. So this is one you'll want to flag as well. The council gets 45 days every year for legislative sessions. That does not count other meetings that they may want to have, like work sessions or public hearings on the budget bill. Legislative session days are important, and they only get 45 days a year, and that's a calendar year. There are 3 kinds of legislative sessions that the council may call. The annual legislative session, is an original provision that the charter board put in place. They envisioned that the council might be operate like the state does, where they had a legislative session every year for a period of time. Originally, I think they planned that the council would do this and they would knock out kind of major legislative initiatives. But as it turns out, the reality of how this county runs is that those kinds of initiatives happen over the course of a year. It turns out the county is not exactly like the state in that kind of way, and they don't really need an annual legislative session like the state does. But originally, the month of May was supposed to be a legislative session. Every day in May can be a legislative day. That is something that we do use to our advantage. May is a nice month because if something pops up that we weren't prepared for, we can make any day a legislative day with notice, and it doesn't require anything special. That was nice in recent years when we did some emergency ordinances and it crossed over into May. We didn't have to do anything special because every day in May is a legislative day. And we only count it if we use it. It only counts towards the 45 days. The second kind of legislative session that the council can call is a monthly legislative session. Those are our standard first and third Mondays of every month. They come together the first and third Monday. Unless it's a holiday, it bumps to a Tuesday. They do not meet in August because there is a recess. They do not meet in November if it is an election year for council members. So every 4 years, November is put on hold. These are the days that are the most significant to the council. First and third Mondays at 7 o'clock are our major legislative days. And then the final type of legislative session that can be called is the one I think you'll be discussing. That is an emergency legislative session. And this provision is interesting because it not only authorizes the calling of an emergency legislative session, but it also is where the term the higher level of an emergency, I should say, is established in the county. So that's where we pull that, I'm gonna move this out of the way here, acute actual emergency is that higher level emergency that the council can call. More on section 208. This is where I mentioned the council can have other meetings that are not considered legislative sessions. That's the authority right there. Of course, every meeting has to have a quorum. That's 4 members. And we have our rules of procedure. They are actually Appendix A to the county code. Section 209, removal from office. Hopefully there's no discussion on that. No, I'm just kidding. And that's it for Article 2 of the charter.
Great, thank you, Ms. Corby. Okay, so I guess I'll first open it up. I know we do have a couple items on our list to discuss specific to the resolution, but before we get into that, I guess I'll ask the members if there's any specific areas outside of that that you would like to discuss from what Ms. Corby just went through.
David Kaufman here. Under compensation, on that slide, did it say it was $2,100 per annum?
It did, yes. And that's the kind of the floor for the council compensation. We talked briefly last time about that salary standard commission that the county does bring together every 4 years. So there is it's a combination of the charter, state law, and our code that kind of makes the compensation of the council happen. The original provision in the charter set that salary for the council members. And then sometime after that, the state came in, they based it actually upon the way that the state does it. They have kind of I think it's called a salary standard commission or something similar that they created for the salaries for the legislators. And they put a state law in place that allowed counties to basically do the same thing. And they just said that they'd said a county can create a salary standard commission by ordinance. So Anne Arundel County did that. So there is a section in code that says there is a salary standard commission. Then you go back to state law, which describes what the salary standard commission does a little more in detail. And I believe, and Ms. Blair Klassmeyer can back me up, there is a provision in that code section of state law that says a council member cannot be paid less than what the charter says. So then you go back to the charter and there's your floor. So you kind of have the lowest that you can go, and then the salary standard commission can work from there. And the county council can by ordinance establish the ceiling, if you want to call it, for the incoming or the next term council members. Under the state constitution, any changes to the council member salaries cannot take effect until the next term.
So Ms. Mansfield, I would just state for the record that that it took 2 to 3 minutes to explain that justifies some clarity in the charter perhaps being provided. I mean, if I were just a casually interested citizen wanting to know how we got to where we are, it would be some acrobatics to get to that point. So I think there might be value in providing clarity to at least point to the charter or to the salary commission.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Kaufman. Yeah, I think that the dollar amount was one thing that did stand out to me for sure. At least maybe if we want to consider, I'm not sure, I don't remember exactly what council members get paid now, but if we wanted to, especially as far as the floor goes, if we wanted to look at that and make it a more reasonable amount. And I know in our first meeting, we did say from the resolution, we did remove from our consideration, evaluate salaries and retirement benefits. But I would agree, I think looking at that section and trying to at least make it clear as to what the process is, seems to make sense. and that dollar amount in particular just seems honestly kind of ridiculous given the times that we are in right now.
No, I think that if it is our practice to allow the salary commission to set the guidelines, then it would seem to me, and again, maybe Ms. Klausmeyer, maybe I'm missing a legal lane or so forth, but in reading that, if I remember correctly, it didn't say shall be paid no less than $2,100 per annum. It says they shall be paid $2,100 per annum, doesn't it?
That's correct. And Ms. Corby pointed out, you have to go this circle of state and county law to get to where it actually is. That's why I raised my hand, because I think that my suggestion would be to make this language more general and say that they would be paid in accordance with, recommendations of the Salary Standard Commission adopted by the county council, or some, which is basically what happens. Right now, the salaries are in the 40,000s. They're nowhere near 2,100. So, but I think, yes, a much more general statement of how they're paid is probably, I agree that if you just read this, you think they get $2,100 a year, and you're not led anywhere to get through that circle. So.
All right, for the other members, commission, do you have any comments on doing that? Concerns with making that clarification? Ms. Hangleiter?
I agree with Lori's statement. I think if you were to put it out on a ballot as a vote to raise the minimum or the amount from 2,100 to 46,000, you're going to get a real stark back, and people aren't going to really understand it, as it just took 3 minutes for us to understand it. So I think her wording is a nice way to think about it, rather than trying to put an arbitrary number that will again be no longer valid in 10 years.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, Mr. Snow?
I was just going to say, I question the value of even bringing this up, especially when we have so many other issues to discuss. And I thought that the whole purpose of our action last meeting was to allow us to close in on our focus on this. And I do feel that, I don't know, kind of stepping in on this could open up the door for a bigger debate that maybe could be had, but given all the issues we're discussing, I feel like we might be better off focusing on the items on our agenda.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Mr. Snow. Yeah, I don't see this item as reopening anything we decided at the last meeting. From my perspective, I think it's more just clarifying that section so it actually makes a little more sense going forward, and hopefully it would be a pretty simple fix to do that. And I think I would agree with you that we decided at the last meeting, as far as evaluating the salaries and retirement benefits, that wasn't something we were going to do. But I think clarifying this section would make sense, at least so it's more understandable.
And I apologize if my understanding was that compensation was one of the buckets that we were talking about, and clarifying the language around it seemed to be part of it. But if we were focused more on the monetary compensation, I apologize for looking at that language tonight.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I mean, I guess I kind of see this one as a simple, maybe I shouldn't put it that way, but clearly more of just a simple clarification to the charter, and then we can then move on. Mr. Snow, your hand's back up.
Yes, I guess if I could just get input from the attorney, would changing this language trigger any potential ramifications for how this process is done? Anytime we start changing the language of the code, even if it seems innocuous, I think I'm just wanting the assurance that it would, if we clarify it, that we're not actually opening the door for any other issues. Do you feel confident that we could make it? Because in principle, I'm very supportive of the measure, but are you reasonably assured that this wouldn't trigger additional potential conflicts or discussions or anything like that?
I think we could, from a legal perspective, we could certainly make it general enough that it shouldn't. However, I can't say that citizens aren't going to all of a sudden start looking at numbers that they never looked at before in considering this, or those, they may ignore it when it just happens in front of the council. Will they suddenly sit up and take notice when it's a question on the ballot, even if it's a general question on the ballot? I can't say one way or the other on that, but we could make it general enough legally that I wouldn't be concerned.
And what in the form that this recommendation would take would simply be a part of our report, and then would the council need to introduce or legislation to change the language related to compensation?
That's correct. They would end up with a resolution that would be the actual language of the charter amendment.
Got it. Which again would go through the normal legislative process, be advertised, published what it was, and could lead to a situation in which the charter, we could make our recommendation, but as we've seen and as has been reiterated, the council will do as it pleases. So this could open the door for them to say, well, yeah, they wanted to change the language, but we'd like to be more specific and make a specific dollar recommendation. That's something that could happen, correct?
Correct. Yes.
Thank you.
In doing that, then they would still need a supermajority, right? So we need 5 votes to do something like that?
Yes, 5 votes for a charter revision. Yep.
Ms.
Charter
Mansfield, Ms. Mansfield, may I just share just a little insight from experience from our office when we deal with this every 4 years? This entire provision just causes confusion. The other part of it that says no member shall be entitled to any allowance except that subject to the approval of the council, he may be allowed his actual necessary expenses, blah, 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 representing the council beyond the geographical boundaries. But then we have allowances in the code that are done through the Salary Standard Commission and that get codified if the council decides to take up a bill. So from a housekeeping standpoint, I will share, having been a part of this for 2 different terms at this point in time, this just always causes a lot of confusion. And I think anything you can do to help not only the elected officials, but also the citizens in the county understand the process, I think it's always a good idea to do that.
Thank you, Ms. Corby. Okay, well then let's add this clarification to our list of items. We can, sure, Ms. Blair Klassmeyer can work on some language for us to consider, maybe at the next meeting or at the point in time we're ready to consider that type of language, but we'll add that to our list. Mr. Waddy?
Thank you. I wanted to ask about the vacancy section, because I know Candace Antoine's vacancy, it was a moment during this past year that I think the vacancy language made a difference, where I'm wondering, if you could describe, Ms. Klausmeyer, Ms. Corby, just what happened in terms of the vacancy. I think there was a requirement that, despite her sudden death, she had to, the position had to be filled within 30 days. And I'm wondering whether or not that was, if it would happen, if it had happened within the first 12 months of her being elected to the school board, then it would have gone back to the voters. But since it happened, late in her term, and her position was filled within 30 days, I think. Is that true?
Well, this section only deals with vacancies on the county council. So I think vacancies on the school board is a matter of state law. And I think that's where those
Okay, I see.
came from.
So has that happened before at the county council level, or?
Having a vacancy, yes. We had a member right when it's been about 20 years now, I guess, when I started with the county, maybe a little longer. We had a member pass away in the chambers. And there was a vacancy, and we had a vacancy with Daryl Jones, I believe, too. So we have had vacancies occur,
Okay.
council.
I'm just trying to, so they were advised to adopt the, I guess the state law that required them to fill the vacancies, and not the county law really had nothing to do with it as well.
Well, for those vacancies on the council, this section would have.
No, I mean, in terms of Miss Antoine, that's all.
Oh, yeah, that was state law. Yep.
Okay. All right. Just
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I guess, Mr. Waddy, is your hand still up, or is it a stale hand, or, okay? Thanks, just wanted to make, thanks, wanted to be sure. All right, so I guess, given then where we are going through, and if there's any other sections anyone would like to bring up outside of the items that we have on our list to discuss, I think the first item is to examine the benefits of increasing the number of councilmanic districts, which would affect sections 201. 201 refers to 7 districts, and as well as section 206 that also refers to the county being divided into 7 councilmanic districts and so forth. So I guess we can open the discussion up on this item. And I know, I think Ms. Blair Klassmeyer, someone in your office kind of pulled together a chart showing how Anne Arundel County compares with other jurisdictions in terms of like population for districts and things like that. So maybe we could just start with that and talk about that a little bit before we open up the fuller discussion.
Sorry, I'm just pulling it back up, getting back to Laura's. There we go. Do you want me to open this as a real document and share it, or maybe?
Yeah, you could do that. Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, okay, let me do that.
Lori, do you want me to bring it up on screen?
Yeah, if you could, because I'd have to go through and find the number. You probably have it right in front of you. There we go. So yes, so I had a paralegal in my office. As you remember, at the end of our last meeting, we had there were a number of questions that were asked, and I had her look at a number of those. And what this does is this compiles kind of all of the questions that came up as far as number of districts, number of council members, if there are at-large council members, and then also looked at the county population and then the average population per councilmanic district, which would kind of be that ideal population that all of us looked at during the redistricting. So this gives you kind of an idea. Frederick and Hartford and Montgomery and Prince George's and Talbot and Wycomico all have at-large council members that run countywide. Anne Arundel, Baltimore, Cecil, and Dorchester do not. And you can see the total number of council members there. So even in Montgomery County, where they have a population almost, well, 40%, 140% of the county at least, they have 5 councilmanic districts, but they have 4 at-large council members for a total of 9. The closest one in population to us, as I look across here, is probably, well, even Baltimore County is significantly more, but they also have 7 councilmanic districts. So each councilmanic district is almost 40,000, has a population almost 40,000 more than our average councilmanic district. So these the numbers are interesting. I'd be happy to answer anything that you need answered, or go back and ask some more questions about any of this information, but it does kind of give you an idea of where the some of our neighbors are in this respect. So, and I believe that you can also link from that document. If you open that document, you can link to the various code provisions where she got that information.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Blair Klassmeyer. Appreciate that. So Mr. Snow, your hand is up.
Yes, I just wanted to make sure I understood the chart. Am I interpreting it correctly that Anne Arundel County, for counties with more than 500,000 population, is far and away one of the best ratios from population to representative? like I just want to make sure I'm interpreting the numbers correctly, but like I think the next closest we have 40,000 less per council rep.
It looks like that, and that would be Harford County. Yeah.
Yeah, like the next, so like Howard County and Harford County are smaller than us, but even still, you know, from a ratio perspective, and I mean, I wouldn't even say they're comparable. I'm thinking about Baltimore County, Prince George's County, Montgomery County, as it relates to population density. We are way better as far as representation. But I just want to make sure I'm interpreting those numbers correctly.
No, that's correct. Those numbers are much higher per district. And the one I can speak to historic, I grew up in Baltimore County. It's always been 7. From Montgomery County, I think recently they had 5 and 2 at large, 5 districts, 2 at large. And I think they just recently added 2 more at large. I think they just went to 9 recently, very recently.
Yeah. For some reason, I think Prince George's made some changes recently too.
That could
They're
be
large or something. Yeah.
And I think that the ones that have, that's the change that they've made, is they've added at large or
Large. Yeah. Okay. Mr. Kaufman?
Yeah, I think as we're having this conversation, I would encourage us to consider that there's 2 almost separate discussions that take place with regards to the number of districts. One is the number of people, a number of residents that are represented by each person on the council. The second is the actual functionality of the council, is the ability of the council to engage in its business, and just being mindful that any increases in that space do not necessarily increase exponentially the efficiency and operations of the governmental body. So I'm not saying don't add people. I'm just saying that we need to be mindful that by adding people, it doesn't necessarily increase efficiency, because you have better representation among the population.
Thank you, Mr. Kaufman. Mr. Telford?
Larry Telford, I think 7 members are fine. If you take a look at Congress, we'd have to take Anne Arundel County and add it to Howard to create approximately 1 congressional district, whereas between those 2 counties, they have 12 representatives on their county council. So I think we're doing a really good job at the local government level, representing the needs of people. I mean, I know, talking to my council member, she never really says she's overwhelmed by interacting with the public and not being able to handle the people that come into her office. It's just not something that happens terribly often. I don't know about the other council members, but I'm leery of adding any more members, which is just going to add cost to everything we're doing. You know, we already had to break the property tax cap a couple of years ago, so it doesn't seem like we have a bunch of extra money sitting around. So I think staying with 7 makes a lot of sense, especially since we spent the last 3 months making sure we have a 7-member county council through the redistricting process. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Telford. Yep, Ms. Hangleiter.
And speaking about the financial burden, I think this is a kind of a question for Ms. Corby. If we were to add 2 more councilmanic districts and 2 more council members, what do you feel additional would be needed? You know, would you need more office staff? What would be required above and beyond just the salaries of those 2 individuals?
Well, I would say we currently need more office staff. We have 7 council members who, 2 years in a row have passed more than 100 bills. That's just bills, not resolutions. We like to forget about those, but they count too. So we have a very busy council, and we are a very small staff. We work a lot. So if we were to add more council members, we would absolutely need more staff. I wouldn't be too concerned about the back of the office space. With more and more people working remotely these days, we have lots of ways of using office space in creative ways to meet those needs. The dais would have to be redone. It currently has 7 seats on it. I would say that's actually the smaller part of the puzzle to me. I would say the other part of the puzzle that would need to be acknowledged is all the other parts of our procedures and the code that reflect 7 members that would have to be updated. That's not a reason to stray away from it, of course. We're always here to do what needs to be done, but it would certainly be a good-sized undertaking. I'm sure that Ms. Blair Klassmeyer can add to this as well, because she works with us on a regular basis.
Yeah, I was just going to say, the Office of Law represents the executive branch, but it also represents the county council. And so if you add 2 more council members, we do a lot of drafting for the council. We answer a lot of questions for the council. We draft amendments. We could end up needing additional personnel as well. And then, of course, each council person has an assistant. So you're not just looking at a council salary, you're looking at the salary of their full-time assistant. That is another consideration, when you're actually doing a fiscal analysis.
Thank you both. That information is very helpful.
Great, thank you. All right, I'm sorry, Mr. Snow, I thought I saw your hand pop up and then I don't see it now. Was it?
I was thinking about, but I'm going to hold my thoughts for a moment.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, well, it sounds like this, based on the comments so far from Mr. Telford, Mr. Kaufman, and Ms. Hangleiter, that they're, because we're all expressing concerns or possible concerns if we would look at this and expanded the number of council members. That's kind of what I'm hearing at this point. Okay, I mean, I know from some, I think, and I'll just because of what I've hear from talking with my council member, I know there's, I think just concerns more like the size of the district and being able to ensure adequate representation given the diversity of some of the districts. I think that was one of the issues that was raised for discussion. And if there are ways that we could deal with that or help address some of that through the charter. I'm not sure if that's really possible, to be honest. I will say it is true when I look at these numbers and just by comparison to some of the other jurisdictions and size, which is why I wanted to see this. I wanted to see if we were like really out of balance with other jurisdictions and the numbers of individuals within them and the districts. And honestly, it really doesn't seem that we are. I mean, as Mr. Snow pointed out, and actually our ratios appear to be much better than some of the other jurisdictions that are out there. So from that perspective, I guess I'll just ask the question, does anyone feel strongly that we should be taking this up and giving more consideration to expanding the number of council districts?
To be clear, if I'm not mistaken, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Corby, the council tasked us with the number of districts and the number of representatives on the council. So the notion of potentially 2 at-large seats or at-large seats in addition to the current 7 fixed districts was part of our task in discussing here. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, I'm just looking at the specific item so I can just read it back to you. It was items 1 and 2. Item 1 is examine the benefits of increasing the number of council managed districts. So you're asking to examine the benefits of increasing the number of council managed districts.
So I mean, in response to that, I'm saying personally that I believe and understand the rationale behind additional members to decrease the ratio per representative. And for me personally, and maybe this is because I'm a little gun shy from having been on an elected body myself, that sometimes just the more people that got involved in the process, the more complicated and complex decision making got. It isn't always a value add to increase numbers. It's always a value add to increase the quality of your representation. So things that we can do to help support that, and doesn't necessarily mean more than 7 for me personally.
Thank you, Mr. Kaufman. Because Ms. Hangleiter, hand is up. Okay. Okay, no worries. All right. Yeah, so given this specific question, yeah, I guess this would just depend on how we would write this up in our report. I guess, do you, at this, do you want to make a motion that we, I don't want to say remove this from our consideration, because I think we did discuss it, and we can, I'm sure we could write up a section in our report about, we appreciate the, the council giving us, and we understand the, we obviously want them to be able to represent their constituents properly, but at this time, we don't see the need to increase the number of districts. Seems to be kind of where we're headed here. Mr. Snow?
Yeah, no, you pretty much said exactly what I was going to say. It doesn't seem like there is a urgent need. I suppose we theoretically could find a benefit, but based on our comparison to other districts, based on the testimony that we have a very active council that is keeping the staff very well busy, getting lots of legislation moved through, there doesn't appear to be any urgent need to make a change at this point in time. We haven't seen any reported challenges or obstacles preventing our members, from getting, doing the work that they're doing. So yeah, I don't see a pressing need for this at this point in time.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I guess this is a question more for Ms. Corby and Ms. Blair Klassmeyer. If we have consensus as we're talking through these items, is that okay? Or would you prefer that we make motions on these things?
So I think I guess I want to be clear. Are you looking to take this off for any consideration, any further consideration? Are you saying that your final report may include what you just discussed, a summary of it? Okay.
Yes, so yeah, our final report would include a discussion, yes.
So yeah, I would say that I would recommend some kind of consensus to that particular, that's sort of a motion. So I would recommend agreement on that.
Do we have to repeat that back to get it correctly?
Can it just be a motion to retain the 7 councilmanic districts and the 7 council members or 7 members of council without adjustment? I'll make that motion.
Yes. Okay, we have a second.
Second.
Second, that was Mr. Telford. All right, good. All right, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Great. Mr. Waddy, was that an aye from you? Or was that
It was a no, as a nay.
No? Okay. Wanted to be sure. I couldn't hear. All right.
So before we go on, I'll just throw out, I saw a little today that the deadline for the filing for candidacy has been extended. So all of that rushing around. So
I know, yeah.
I'll just throw that out there since it spends a lot of time on that.
So all kidding aside, all of that rushing around does in fact now give some people a chance to actually think during the course of this month between what would have been the deadline and the next deadline. So while I don't know that we all were always in the same space, and I think what we ended up with was appropriate and suitable, and now it may actually, because we got it done, it may actually have impacted candidacy. So good job, everyone.
Yep.
Agree, absolutely.
And yes, I did seethe when I saw that at first also, so.
Yeah. All right, so the next item then that we have on our list to discuss in this section is examine allowing members of the county council to serve in office for 3 full consecutive 4-year terms. And I guess I'll open that up for discussion. I mean, there are a couple jurisdictions that do allow or do have 3 consecutive terms. Looks like it's Frederick, Howard, Montgomery. And I can't remember, well, I didn't print this out on legal size paper, so I'm missing the last couple columns. For some reason, I think Prince George's County, I can't remember if there are 3 terms or 2 terms, but I think a couple of the others they don't have, there's no term limits.
PG is 2, and Talbot and Wycomico have no term limits, as neither do Baltimore, Cecil, Dorchester, or Hartford. So
Okay.
it looks like
Sounds good.
we are the only one that has the limit. Oh, us and Prince George's have 2.
Mhm. Yeah, so we're like, it's a little bit of an outlier then on that
Now,
one.
I will say Howard and Montgomery have 3 terms or 2 terms and a partial term of more than 2 years. We, in the situation I talked about that happened more than 20 years ago, that gentleman was, I'm not even sure he was a full year into his term. The person who took his place was able to complete his term and then serve 2 full consecutive terms. So that person served about 11 years. But so I'll just throw that out there. But
Okay, thank you. Okay, Mr. Telford.
Well, a couple of things. Cliff Roop was the council member who died. I think he died 3 months into his term. So Kathy Vitale almost got a full 4-year term.
brief, right? Yeah, it's exactly
Question,
it. Yep.
question for county staff. I like the concept of increasing the terms to 3, but I understand that if that happens, does the pension benefits for these council members change because of is vesting now 10 years for them, or is this for? Could someone just explain the whole defined benefit plan for county employees, county council members, and how this would impact it if we go from 2 to 3 terms? That's sort of my big question here.
Boy, would I like to be able to explain the entire defined benefit plan. But anyway, right. So over the years, their benefit, the vesting time for council people has changed. It's, they had their own plan for a while. They got merged into what we call the employee plan, which means they're not in one of the bargaining group plans. I believe now if you're elected, it's a 10-year vesting, and that is this is the defined benefit plan. The county also has a defined contribution plan, which would be a 401A where you put your money in. It's kind of like a deferred compensation. You determine how it's invested. You don't get a defined benefit when you retire, but you can take your money with you. And when you retire, it's tax deferred. When you retire, then you can decide how it gets distributed to you. So similar to a 401k, it's just a 401A. So I did talk to, this was one of the questions that was on the list, and I did talk to our pension / tax attorney that we use to consult on these matters. And he indicated to me that there would be no issue with the question that was raised to me was whether or not council members could be confined to the 401A deferred contribution plan and taken out of the deferred benefit plan. And the answer to that is they could be, moving forward, they could be restricted to the 401A defined contribution plan. But you can't change their compensation in a term, and you probably can't change the benefit of anybody who has somehow vested in the existing defined benefit plan. But there would be no problem with changing what plan they would be entitled to, or even coming up with a new plan, even that only applied to elected officials or council members. So, so currently they are in the defined benefit plan. And if they manage to vest in that plan, they get 2% per year for each year of service at the highest 3 years salary. So if you would have managed to work 10 years, you would vest and you would get 20% of the average of your highest 3 years upon retirement. Retirement is age 60 with any numbers of years of service or 30 years of overall service. There are also provisions relating to transferring service and things of that nature. There are ways to get to the 10 years, even if you're only elected for 8 years. There's possible you could get to 10 years. So, or with the gentleman or with Kathy Vitale, who served almost 3 full terms because she filled a vacancy, she would have vested in the plan, for example. So.
Sure, but so are you saying that we could increase the term limits from 2 to 3 and at the same time limit council members to remain and to be in a 401A plan?
Newly
regardless
elected,
regardless of their number of years on the council?
yes, newly elected could be,
Newly elected. So
Right.
would newly elected be in 2026 then, I guess? Because this would have to be on the ballot in 2022.
right, it would have to get right. Well,
And would it affect the current members or just anyone new who comes in after this moment in time?
so the pension plan can be changed at any time. So,
Okay,
we wouldn't have to wait for this to pass or to have some different change or have some change in the term limit for a change to the pension plan.
right.
The implication I got from talking to Mr. Downey, the attorney that I was speaking with, was that as long as you don't change it during the current term, which is a Maryland constitutional issue, that you could change it for anyone who's not vested. So, which means that if you decided this summer, if the council decided this summer they were going to change their pension benefit, it would be effective for anybody elected in 2022. So that doesn't have to track any kind of term limit thing. That could just be done. The worst case scenario is that's incorrect. The worst case then would be that newly elected council members in 2022 or after would be subject to this restriction on the pension plan.
So with this example, I just want to make sure I understand the defined benefit part without forcing them to stay in 401A. If a council member was elected at age 48, served 12 years, did their 3-year term, the pension would basically immediately kick in when they leave office in my hypothetical, correct?
Correct.
And if they lived to be, let's say, 84, they would have served for 12 years and been getting pension benefits for 24.
Correct.
Okay. I'm in favor of a 3-term limit. I'm also in favor of making sure we don't have part-time employees getting 25 years of pension benefits. And those are my thoughts on agreeing to increase the term limits from 2 to 3. I don't know if would that be a single question on the ballot, or is the pension thing something the county council would split out, or assuming they'd even agree to this, how exactly would that work?
So the pension is separate. It's not part of at the moment, I believe, if I'm looking back here. Yeah, it's technically compensation.
Okay.
So there could be a revision to the compensation section that talks about the pension, but the pension, I don't see that as being part of, I think it's 2 separate questions.
So this will
when it
get back
comes
to
term limits.
the other commission.
To the Salary Review Commission.
Correct.
I have to look at that. I
Okay.
know.
Well, regardless,
recommendations.
we could, if we agree to my big idea, that the council would at least know where we stand on.
Right. I think your report could reflect you're in favor of 3-year term limits, but that the issue of pension should be revisited.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Telford. Mr. Snow.
I was going to echo those sentiments more. I mean, from my perspective, I think that I would appreciate that we have parity among members of the council, so that we kind of have a general same standard. So yeah, I have no objections to a 3-term limit, with the idea of making sure that we're considering the role of the pension.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kaufman.
Yeah, I would. It's always the parallel conversations. One of the other requests for us to discuss is whether or not we take people from part-time to full-time status on the council. And I would suggest that if somebody is willing to be a full-time member of the council for 12 consecutive years, they're giving that up in their personal career And I would suggest that a pension, withholding pension in that kind of setting is unreasonable because they're allocating 12 years of their life to being a full-time council member. So that's, but to me, I think really the discussion on pension probably is one for the salary commission. You know, our discussion probably, and I agree, Mr. Telford, that having the rationale provided behind, you know, being comfortable with a three-term part-time is different than a three-term full-time with regards to sending that message, in my opinion. I also think if I'm remembering correctly, would it only be let's see. So Lacey is not running. Hare is not running for a council seat, and Pruski's not running for a council seat. So it would be the other four members who potentially, if they decided to run for reelection. Now, I don't remember where each of them are on that, but if it's voted in 22 and they're reelected this year, they would then be potentially eligible for that third term. So up to four of the current council members would be eligible. Am I reading that correctly?
Right now, Mr. Pruski is the only one who is in his second term. So you have 6 members who, if they ran this time, would be eligible for a third term. That was the question, right?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding was that Hare had announced for for executive, and that Lacey had announced for Senate. So I was just making that assumption. So
right, so they'll be with the other 4. Mm-hmm.
Should they run? Gotcha. Okay.
They run. Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Kaufman. All right. Yeah, I guess from my perspective, I mean, I'm comfortable expanding a number of terms to 3. And I guess I would I guess if we said the salary commission would be the entity that would look at the pension benefit things, I think I would feel comfortable with that. I don't want us to do something that's gonna like be so restrictive that, you know, should there be changes that we're not able to take those into consideration. So I guess, Mr. Telford, I wasn't sure if your motion, were you suggesting I guess the specific question is whether examine allowing members of the county council to serve in office for 3 full consecutive 4-year terms, which sounds like we have, for that piece of it specifically, seems like we have agreement that, yes, we would recommend they can serve the 3 terms. However, the pension piece, I guess, is something that, for clarification, I'm not sure, Mr. Telford, if you could just reiterate what you were suggesting, that would be helpful.
This is Larry Telford. I view the county council members as part-time employees. And what I don't want to have happen is people running for the county council for 12 years merely because they get, by most people's standards, a pretty nice pension compared to any of us who don't work for government, right? I mean, that's basically the only group of people left in America that gets guaranteed pension benefits outside of course, Social Security. And that I would just like to have this council express that we really don't want people running and staying in office. If you're in office 8 years, because of that pension benefit dangling in front of your face, it's almost it's gonna probably be smart for you to seek another term. And I don't think that should ever be an incentive. I don't think it should be incentive to originally run for office, and I don't think it should be an incentive to stay in office for another term merely because all of a sudden you go from 0 to whatever the percentage turns out to be. That would be my concern.
Okay, I understand. Yep. Thank you for clarification. Mr. Kaufman, I saw your hand up next.
Yep, and certainly, I think that's very reasonable, Mr. Telford. I mean, I'm not disputing that. I think we also need to, for the purposes of this conversation, distinguish between whether or not we are suggesting that the council members are eligible for a third term, or the council members and county executive are eligible for a third term, because obviously the nature of the compensation in those positions are dramatically different. And I don't, again, I just want to make sure that as we're talking, are we saying that that the two are linked, or are we just talking about the elected council members rather than the elected county administrator or county executive, sorry.
Yeah, I think for our purposes, I would suggest we're only referring to the county council members, not the county executive at all, just strictly the county council members. Thank you. Mr. Snow.
Can the language of our recommendation reflect the reservations around a pension, not necessarily one way or the other, but, you know, we're comfortable with the extension of the term, but we do have concerns about the pension implications. Can that be kind of how it's worded? So we're not necessarily saying one way or the other, but we would definitely share reservations about having, you know, a different pensioning system.
You know, I would think so. I mean, I'm thinking maybe what we could say is that the commission would support expanding or increasing the number of terms to 3 full terms for council members. However, you know, we did discuss pension benefits, and we would, how do we want to say that? That we feel the appropriate body to determine the appropriate approach to pensions would be the Salary Review Commission, kind of put it that way to them. Mr. Telford?
Larry Telford, is it possible we could say that under the current law, if we were to extend it from 2 to 3 terms, that third term system triggers pension benefits that are not available to 2-term county council members right now? And that's my big concern.
Actually, I like that. Yeah, that when we make the statement, it raises the issue and makes it clear it's something for consideration. Okay. All right. So then our guess
So I'm
our
clear that
motion.
I'm clear. I'm sorry. So I'm clear. So it's because the third term gets them to the 10-year vesting. Correct. Okay. I just want to make sure I have this right. My note.
Yep. No, thank you. All right. So then it sounds like our motion would be then the committee supports expanding the number of terms for a council member to serve from 2 to 3 consecutive terms. And I'm not going to get the rest of this right. You said it much better than I did. However, the expansion in the number of terms does raise issues regarding pensions or would possible. Mr. Telford, go ahead and add the rest of that for me.
I like the word trigger being in there. I think that's what,
okay.
I think that's sort of the key phrase to it.
May trigger additional pension benefits, which need to be considered.
It triggers pension benefits not available to 2-term council members right now. So
right, got it. All right. So could I get a motion for that recommendation? Right. Thank you, Mr. Telford. In a second.
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Snow. All in favor? We can say aye or raise your hand. I can see everybody in the. Okay, those opposed? Okay, Mr. Waddy. I think there were no abstentions, correct? I saw Ms. Hanglighter, myself, Mr. Kaufman, Mr. Snow, and Mr. Telford. Right. Okay, Mr. Waddy in opposition. Okay, great. All right, let's moving on. Okay, so I guess those are the 2 items from the resolution for our discussion. I know in the public comments, Mr. Svensson submitted suggestions related to the districts and regarding really a whole new approach to where there's dual representation. I'm trying to find that document really quickly. Basically, what he was suggesting is we would divide the county into four districts and go down to 4 council members or 4 council districts, which given our recommendations already to keep it at the 7, I think that kind of makes that mute for our discussion purposes at this time. Everyone okay with that? All right. Okay, so before we move on to Article 3, any other comments or questions to come up regarding Article 2 that we haven't yet discussed? All right, seeing none. All right, Ms. Corby, Article 3.
Sorry, I have to, in my excitement and closing things down, I closed that one down accidentally. Sorry about that. Okay, so we're on to Article 3, the legislative branch. Section 301 is pretty self-explanatory, that the legislative branch is the council and me and the other employees in the legislative branch. We are small but mighty. Actually, the legislative branch does include the auditor, technically includes the auditor and the auditor's office, and the Board of Appeals as well. Section 302, officers. Again, pretty self-explanatory. We get a presiding officer. Every December, the council has to decide on a chair and vice chair. They do that by resolution. I don't know that the charter actually states that it has to be done by resolution. However, we do it by resolution because it creates a nice piece of paper in the record that we can always go back to if need be. Subsection B is refers to me pretty much. It talks about some of the basic duties that I have to do and then some of the other things that we have to do as well. Section 303. This one's pretty important actually. And we frequently remind the council of this one in particular. The council has to act as a body. They're not allowed to create standing committees, although they are allowed to appoint commissions such as this one, or delegate its functions. And the one thing that they are allowed to do is appointing special ad hoc committees, which I haven't seen done in the time I've been with the county, but they can do it. Section 304, pretty self-explanatory. Section 305, also pretty self-explanatory. The council can only do what they're allowed to do by law. Section 306 talks about the legislative powers of the council. This is where you find a good reference to the Express Powers Act, which is now the local government article, a part of the local government article in state code. This is where the council as a charter county gets a lot of its powers and authority and tells us what we can and can't do in terms of legislating. Section 307 is pretty important. This is one that you will probably come back to because it has the second prong to the emergency ordinance issue. But this is pretty important. This is one that we kind of live by. Public meetings. This one is also interesting. I get a lot of questions about the county council in closed sessions. The Board of Education, for example, is allowed to do closed sessions. The council is not allowed to do closed sessions. All of their meetings have to be open to the public. End of story. All of our bills begin with an enacting clause and a title. Under state law, each bill can only embrace one subject. We call that the one subject rule. That is a pretty important rule to what we do. Ordinances and resolutions, or bills and resolutions, pretty much what we do all day, every day. Procedure for passing ordinances. I would say this is pretty self-explanatory as well. There are some interesting provisions in here that talk about voting and what can and can't be done and the importance of legislative days. Okay, so this is your second part here. This is when you want to flag procedure for passing emergency ordinances. This is pretty important to your discussion. Votes required. No ordinance. It's all 4 votes unless it says otherwise. There are some 5-vote bills, emergency bills. Charter amendment resolutions are 5 votes. It's interesting too, because a couple of council members have recently asked about increasing the number of council manning districts, a topic that you discussed this evening. And we've had some fun discussions lately about the importance of maintaining an odd number of council districts, no matter what you do, because if you have an even number, we would have a hard time passing things because of the way the votes would line up. Publication of county laws. This is something that falls on me. This is one of my pretty big duties in terms of publicizing our bills. Effective dates of ordinances. I think this might come up in your conversation because this talks about emergency legislation as well. Generally speaking, all of our bills become effective 45 days after they're signed by the county executive, except there are these exceptions listed here. This is the process for an executive veto. If the county executive decided to veto a bill, this is what we come to. It's a lot of fun. You have to, we got 5 days and then 10 days, and then it's just a procedure. This one, section 308, the referendum. I'm sure Ms. Blair Klausmeyer can talk a little bit about this tonight if you're interested in hearing more about this. This might have been in the news recently. Section 309, this is a pretty important one that we like to remember all the time, non-interference with executive branch. It's a two-way street. The two branches are separate branches, and there are ways that we collaborate. Otherwise, we do try to stay out of each other's way. Okay, section 3010, that's the county auditor. The rest of these provisions, except for the very last one, deal with the county auditor. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over these. I'm just going to breeze through them quickly. The duties of the county auditor have come under scrutiny in the past, 8 years. We've had some amendments to the charter relating to this, what the county auditor can and can't do, what they're supposed to do, what their role is in the county. This is something that the county auditor has to do. This is her audit stuff. So this is the stuff we're going to come back to. Special assistance. This is something the council can do if need be. Occasionally we do this. It takes a resolution if we need outside legal help, which is typically when we have done this. I think we might have done it in the past, 4 or 5 years to get some extra help with audit services. And the council is allowed to do that. They just have to pass a resolution. So that's pretty much Article 3. I went through that pretty quickly, and I'm going to hand it over to you all, Ms. Blair Klausmeyer, and I'm going to check in with our county auditor.
I don't have a whole lot to add. I did have Laura, Ms. Corby, provide you with a memo on the 208 versus 307 emergency ordinance, because I think that it's all very, very confusing, especially if you never have to deal with it. And I know we've talked about it a couple of times where we have the actual acute emergency, which is described under 208 D. And then again in 307F, the procedure for passing emergency ordinances. 208D describes an emergency ordinance. And then we have the emergency ordinance on effective date under the effective date provision 307I, which is what I think I've noticed one of the members of the public referred to as an expedited ordinance. And that really is, it is the difference between acute emergency and something that needs to be expedited because of the 45, it can't wait for the 45 days. And that is 45 days is driven by the referendum section, which is 308, the 45 days required to give citizens the ability to file a referendum against any particular piece of legislation. So, we can certainly discuss that further. If anybody's interested, or if you have any questions about what I provided, I'm happy to go over it with you. The emergency ordinance, the acute emergency ordinance, generally comes up in the situation of a civil emergency. The ones that obviously with COVID, there have been more emergency ordinances, acute emergency ordinances, probably in the past 2 years than there were in the 20 years before that. The kind of civil emergencies we had prior to COVID were things like big snowstorms or something like that, where there may need to be some legislation dealing with funding to fund issues related to the emergency, or to approve the declaration of civil emergency. A civil emergency only lasts for 7 days, and then it needs to be the county executive's declaration of civil emergency only lasts for 7 days, and then it needs to be approved by the county council. So those kinds of things come up maybe every few, they're kind of few and far between. Like say big snowstorms. I think probably Hurricane Isabel in 2002, there was probably a civil emergency. But at the same time, things like that also end up with state declarations of emergency and federal declarations of emergency that play into all of that. So I'm perfectly happy to answer any questions you might have about this, but that's kind of the memo, I think, sets forth kind of how the two play with each other. So.
Go ahead, Mr. Waddy.
I was just wondering what types of authority the county council is working from during the emergency. So they're authorizing the county executive to exercise what types of authority. Are they limited in terms of what they can allow the county executive to do?
So so there's a whole subtitle in the code that deals with civil emergencies, and it provides a list of things that the county executive can do in the event of a civil emergency. And part of it is he can declare a civil emergency, but then he has to come before the council to extend it beyond 7 days. And then there's a provision in state law that says even with extending it, it can't be extended beyond 30 days. So there are limits. However, there is kind of a catch-all as well. So the council itself doesn't have the ability to declare an emergency. That's considered under the code, it's an executive function. So other than approving what the county executive does in that regard, it doesn't have the ability to initiate the declaration of a civil emergency.
When I was reading the Green Book, and I was trying to see whether or not, I mean, they really hate commissions, the county commission. It's like this thing, they really hate it.
The commissioner form of government was not popular. Yeah,
not at all, not at all. And I'm wondering, like, whether or not there was like a civil emergency discussion, during that period where before the charter, that you might be able to give us a little insight into.
Yeah, I don't know. I know that our civil emergency code provisions arose out of the events in 1968. And when you read it and you know that, you can see that that's where it came from. The things, the powers that were given to the county executive are the kind of things that that are more related to civil unrest than things like
storms,
than things like COVID or storms or pandemics. It's not quite the same. So I don't know. So the charter itself doesn't address civil emergency. It just talks about acute legislation related to acute emergencies. And that could be that there's a water main bust. I mean, it's not necessarily a hurricane or a snowstorm or a pandemic. It could be something like there's some water main that bursts and there's some capital project that needs to be, dealt with, or there's money that needs to come from somewhere, or, we have to go hire people to do something in an emergency basis. So it's not always, so an acute emergency is not always something that would be related to a declaration of a civil emergency. It's anything that would deal with property, safety of property, persons, health and welfare. So,
in your
pardon?
Pre-charter, how do you think, how would you surmise that the commission, those powerful commissioners who
dealt with it?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'd have to go back and look. I'm not even sure what their powers were under state law at that time.
Okay.
To deal with it. I have to go back and look at.
Okay, thank you.
I was a baby then. Unfortunately, I was born then, unlike probably many of you, but.
I'll check it out. I have to check it out myself. Thank you.
Mr. Kaufman?
Yeah, I think it's 307A under the presiding officer. Is it appropriate at this time to just suggest that moving forward, we change the term chairman to simply chair, and then in all appearances in this section and throughout the document, but just having the term chair replace the appearance of chairman anywhere it appears in the charter?
Yeah, and I think that's part of our gender neutrality that we've talked about, and then I'm researching is what the best way to approach that. I'm going to work with Ms. Corby on that. What the best way to approach. I mean, I think I think I've heard that that's going to be a recommendation. I think it's a so that would definitely be part of it. We are using chair now on all of our legislation. So
I just think as we're doing these types of quick tutorials when they're appearing, it's helpful because there's obviously so many words in the charter as it is. We know that that's an area where it is particular and specific to assigning the duties of that position. The other thing, and this can be something we can take a look at later to Mr. Snow's point about trying to stay on task, but I'd be interested in seeing that section H, publication of laws, to determine if that's sufficient language to address how we receive information now. It may very well be, but if that could be something that if you're able to just resend that to me, by email, I'll take a look at that. And I was starting to read through it, and I just be interesting to see if it's appropriate for modern communications.
in the 21st century, sure. Sure.
Can I bring that up on the screen? Because I think there's something in there I would love to point out. So in this, it's section 307H, publication of county laws. It says that it has to be posted on an official bulletin board to be set up by the county council in a public place. So we have a bulletin board actually outside of our office in the Arundel Center. And because this is in the charter, we still all the time make sure that that bulletin board is up to date. We do not stray from that, even when the building is closed to the public, as it was for a long period of time, even when we have like 2 or 3 people pass through our building every day, if that, we still have that bulletin board. So I would love to see that brought up to this century to reflect practices that are already in use and that would benefit the public in better ways than a bulletin board outside of our office.
That makes sense.
I agree.
Yes, absolutely agree.
I mean, there are provisions of state and county law that still require newspaper publication. I think we're even getting to the point where that is no longer, unfortunately, 21st century. But.
Yep, agree. Okay, yeah, we can definitely deal with that. Mr. Snow.
Sure. I have a couple of questions, perhaps for Ms. Corby. So number 13, if I understand the question here, aren't legislators already allowed to use emergency ordinances to address a situation that need immediate actions?
So Ms. Blair Klassmeyer may want to answer that, but yeah, the simple answer to your question is yes. I think that these 2 requests from the council stemmed from some of the difficulty in understanding how the 2 types of emergencies do work together and what the procedure is for those. If you remember in the beginning of this meeting, that little 3-minute explanation that I did where you go charter, state code, just to talk about salary, it is the same thing with emergency legislation. And we go through that every time. So yeah, anything that you could do to suggest sort of stating things a little bit more clear, better, something like that, I think would definitely help. But they can do it, I think, under the current structure, definitely.
Well, I think to kind of clarify, even as we were kind of going through and I was kind of glancing at it, it does seem like that we are pretty explicit in how certain pieces of legislation are used and what's required for them that require immediate action. So I think if for the sake of efficiency, I feel like number 14 is what we should be focusing on. If I'm understanding your explanation right, the real question is how do we make sure that the process makes logical sense in the code, not necessarily if there should be like new provisions in there. Does that make sense? What I'm getting at, like, I feel like 13 is redundant and 14 is where we should focus on 14 is where we're getting to what you're really asking.
I think they work together, yeah, and they show again, it's like, it could be a lot more sort of 1, 2, 3. Right now you have to jump all over the place. So that would make it easier.
I agree that it should probably be clarified. Because every time there's a question about this, I do have to pull out my memo I sent to you of what the difference is between the two. And I think that if it was kind of more in, and maybe more in one place instead of, as Corbett says, kind of a round robin again, that would be helpful. And, I can certainly work on bringing you language that I think would help clarify that. I'm happy to do that.
I think from the role on the Charter Review Commission, I'm thinking, obviously, well, you basically said, well, I don't know how I would reword it, but I liked the way that it was described, and to the extent that we can match the current process, my recommendation might be to say, if there's an opportunity to make a distinction between emergency ordinances for the purposes of actual emergencies, and maybe if there is an opportunity to use something like expedited legislation for, we still want the functionality available, but maybe we change the language. I wouldn't know the legal implications of changing that, but that's kind of where I'd like to focus on streamlining that process and the language around it. Maybe that would help. That's my suggestion.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Snow. I think that's a good suggestion. Yeah, and like I wouldn't be able to sit here tonight and tell you like what type of language that should look like. But Ms. Blair-Klassmeyer, if that's something you can work on and bring back a recommendation to us at the next meeting, I think that would be great.
Sure.
And like Mr. Snow was saying, I think being able, because I think a lot of times like some of these emergency items you're dealing with probably are dealing with budget issues, or in May you're trying to do some a budget amendment or moving funds around to cover something. I think we want to keep that flexibility, but I think that's definitely separate and apart from these other types of emergencies that may like COVID or other things, or natural events that we're talking about. So I think if you could bring some language, that would be great. I'm sorry, Mr. Snow, is your hand up
Sorry,
again?
yes, I do have a follow-up question. Maybe for Ms. Corby, is there anything right now that prohibited the council from taking the action that they felt appropriate? And I suppose the question is, is the process currently working? You guys are finding a way to make it work with the law. We're just simply clarifying it, or do we actually need to change, like make substantive changes to what's allowed in the charter, within the context of our recent emergencies? So is it broken and just needs a better instruction manual? Or is it working and just needs a better instruction manual? Or is there something that's actually broken that we should actually fix?
So first of all, I think it's important to recognize that some of the original stuff in the charter that was put in the 63, it was recommended in 1963 and added in 1964, was based on some provisions in the state constitution at the time. The one provision in the state constitution is no longer there. It was repealed, I think, in the 70s. So with the one level of an emergency, you do have state law to fall back on. With the other level of emergency, you don't necessarily have state law to fall back on. There's other things to fall back on, like precedents and all that. But my viewpoint on all of it is that the tools are there. It's just the toolbox is a mess. Does that help?
Yeah, I just want to make sure that, if we're not actually debating on what should be changed or what power should exist, then I'm actually very comfortable with, kind of a rework of the language and feel like that's how we should approach this particular element of the conversation, kind of using our processes that we currently have as a guide.
And I will say section 208 of the charter is the one that really talks about the types of sessions that the council can call, right? And it kind of, mushes in there emergency legislative session, which makes sense because that's one of the kinds of legislative sessions. But then built in there is the definition of the one level of emergency, the acute actual. And from there, you kind of do have some trouble deciding which road to take. So cleaning that up in the sense that you could allow section 208 to really just address sessions, the types of sessions, and then perhaps you could consolidate the emergency. I don't want to call them definitions, but for lack of a better term, I'm just going to say definitions. And then the procedure for those kinds of emergencies might be more helpful rather than us having to jump back and forth between these two articles and cobble it all together all the time. That's just my view on it.
Okay, great. All right, so then why don't we go ahead, maybe if Ms. Blair Klassmeyer can pull together some language for us to consider, we'll do that at our next meeting. Discuss and finalize this item. Okay, great. Okay, that takes care of, I think, items 13 and 14. Are there any other? I know we have the county auditor with us. So why don't we go ahead and Ms. Bolayer, allow you to speak, and then we can come back just to see if there's any other items to bring up in Article 3. Thank you, Ms. Bolayer, for being here tonight. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I am coming in a little bit, I guess, fresh to the process. So do you want kind of an overview of what we do as it relates to the charter, or where would you guys like me to focus?
Well, I guess let me ask, I know Ms. Corby kind of went through the various sections from Article 3 that deal with the auditor. For the committee members, do you have any questions specifically from Ms. Bolayer? Would you like her to provide a little more detail on her role? Would that be helpful? Or, okay, Mr. Snow, I see your hand.
Sure. I suppose my main question was, do you identify any obstacles or anything that is impeding your ability to do your job with efficiency and effectiveness?
That is a broad question.
Well, maybe I'll narrow the scope. Is there something that is a real pain point for you as you do your work that we can consider?
I think he's specifically asking if there is a specific person on staff or council that you'd like to call out in this meeting as a source of any irritation. That was Tori Snow.
Oh my goodness. So just for a little context, I started in this role on April 1st. So it's definitely been like drinking from a fire hose. We did have a charter amendment come through that passed by the voters to kind of expand the definition of what we do. We found that it wasn't particularly reflective of kind of our role where it's ended up versus where the description started. It used to be focused strictly on auditing anything that had to do with revenues or expenditures for county funds. And really, as you see in a lot of the surrounding counties, local government auditing, state government auditing as a whole, there's really more of a focus on performance type auditing. So we're looking more broadly at the use of those resources. What do the programs, are they doing what was intended? Are they using the resources well? Which is a bit of a different kind of take on that. We spend a lot of time looking at the internal controls, what are the processes in place. So that's the section 311 of the charter, right? More broadly than that, though, I think Laura had sent me the resolution. I believe it was in 2015, but it didn't codify, but it described kind of those other duties as assigned. So a lot of what we do is focused on the fiscal impact of legislation. And because the meetings come around so quickly, I find that that tends to take a lot of the focus of our resources. We're a staff of 10 positions, and those can be difficult audit positions to fill. So we currently have 8. And a lot of those resources are going to legislation. We review the annual budget, and then we also have the special community benefit districts. We're, I guess, charged by state law to review that all of their annual financial reports are in compliance with state law. So I guess my biggest challenge is trying to actually focus resources on audits. We've been making progress in kind of streamlining some things, hopefully focusing more of the review of legislation strictly on fiscal impact. I feel like historically there's been a little bit of overlap between maybe some of the legislative summaries. So we try to rely upon the Office of Law for their analysis of kind of the policy side of things, the legal impact, the summary of what those bills are doing, and carve out more time to focus on the actual audit work. Within the category of audits, there's kind of the full-blown is the generally accepted government auditing standards. Those are called yellow book audits. They're large, they take a long time, and they have a lot of strict standards that we have to follow. That is generally what we do, but the section 311 of the charter actually also gives us the kind of ability to perform special reviews. So that's going to be more if we get a fraud tip or we start looking into something, if there's an area that we want to feel should be focused on, we can do more of a small review versus a full-blown, maybe department-wide audit or things that tend to be much larger. So that answer the question. It's kind of a flyby, but probably went too far into the details for a few of the areas.
I just
Sorry about that. Mr. Wadi, go ahead.
Thank you. I was just wondering, just kind of follow that up to see if you have seen any particular trends across the counties in Maryland, I guess, and also in your profession regarding auditing and expansion, or the types of audits that you're doing.
So I'll kind of answer that in twofold. Yes, we're seeing, I think, in some of the surrounding counties, just within the state of Maryland, a move towards more inspector general type roles. That can be twofold. It gets into the investigation side of things, which is a bit more complicated, but it also can be more of an independent. They have more structural things to kind of keep everything independent. So we see various counties moving towards that. But also one of the areas that I've kind of been looking at and trying to glean from other experiences is sort of what that piece of the legislation, where that's housed, because it's so different at the state level. It's a larger, much larger organization where it's pretty well separated. I mean, that's kind of a different function. A lot of times it can be a different sort of background as well, because you might have more people with a legal background or the kind of political side of things in terms of how the legislation is written. Whereas it's kind of an interesting combination with what we do, because it's we're always taking the word of the administration to put together the fiscal impact, versus if we were doing an audit, then we would be digging in more into the details. So those are kind of two separate areas. And in terms of the legislation, it varies. I think Baltimore County is structured more similarly to ours, and then some of them are more of an internal audit function. Some have full-blown inspector general offices where it's more clearly delineated. Does that answer your question?
It does. I was just wondering a little bit. You said taking the word of the county executives, just, in terms of their offices, and whether or not you feel as though that's something that might need to be changed, or do you feel as though it's something that is working for you? Works for the people, I guess, is really, where we're coming from.
I guess it can work, but it provides some challenges, right? So we're always trying to accomplish what we're tasked with, right? So I can give kind of an independent view of what the fiscal impact might be, which I think is really important, right? If you have an administration putting together a piece of legislation and they say it's not going to cost very much, it's important to kind of have that check and balance. But sometimes, like today, I got an inadvertent paragraph included, and then they said, oh, please ignore that. That wasn't supposed to go to you. Well, it was kind of diluting the response of how much a particular piece of a bill might cost to implement. Well, if we were auditing, that would not work, right? Because we would be digging in and looking at evidence and trying to kind of substantiate that more. But with the blue letters, that's the report that we give before each council meeting. We don't see the legislation until it's introduced, or we can't really start working on it until it's introduced, and then it gets heard 4 weeks later. So that letter is due the Wednesday before. So you're already talking about maybe 3.5, maybe 4.5 weeks, depending on how the calendar falls, to understand the bill, reach out, get any support that's available. And for some of them, it's not very much. For other ones, I joke I had to become like a forest conservation expert because it was a culmination of clearly years worth of work that we had for 3.5 weeks to analyze. So to me, there has to be a reasonableness in the expectation. So as long as we have that, but obviously that varies. I report to 7 council members. So, certain bills they're going to want a lot of details about, rightfully so. But whether I can get those together in that time period can be challenging.
I just wanted one last question in terms of like receiving the information from, I guess, state mandated legislation. Does that play a role also in terms of the timing?
That's been interesting because sometimes we learn about it in the newspaper. So we're not always involved. I know that there were 2 agencies where they specifically named us as having the right to audit them in the prior, I guess, last year's session. That makes it clearer, but we're kind of going through a process now, of trying to kind of isolate our audit universe because it's not always clear like that. It's not always clearly defined, but just because it's not specified doesn't mean that they wouldn't fall. So sometimes agencies are clearly audited by the state, which would be, let's see, like I think the Register of Wills, some of those areas, but then other areas come specifically through the county for funding. The Board of License Commissioners, the sheriff, things like that. So I think that operationally, the sheriff more clearly falls under the county, but those are all areas that we're trying to kind of clarify. So sometimes in the state enabling legislation, it's very clear, but then sometimes it's not. But just because it's not clear doesn't mean that we're not included in that kind of role. Does that answer?
Thank you. And Mr. Snow?
I just want to make sure that I'm understanding what I've heard. What we're hearing from the county auditor is that the county auditor would like to audit more.
We joke. That is the number. I say that all the time with my staff. Yes.
So maybe just for the sake of the commission, if I'm understanding, could our report include something to the end of there are challenges with perhaps I'm interested that you use the term you're doing the work that an inspector general might do, and that is impeding at times impeding your ability to actually meet the core functionality of your job. And perhaps our recommendation should be something along the lines of re-examining the role of the auditor and the potential benefits of having a separate role with the inspector general so those duties can be more fairly assigned and be more efficiently done. Is that's kind of what I'm hearing. Am I accurately capturing the spirit of what you're saying?
Yes, close. The only caveat is the Office of Inspector General more closely reflects performance audits, whereas it's more of kind of that think the state calls it the Office of Policy and Analysis. It's kind of that legislation, the Department of Legislative Services for the state, where they have a group of people that are working on legislation and analyzing that. It also kind of bleeds into some of the budget work. I always find it very interesting, probably because of where I sit in this process, but we don't see anything to do with the budget, which is really just one large piece of legislation until the proposed budget comes out. So the county, the legislative branch has, I think, 6 weeks from the time it gets introduced until it has to be voted on. And so I think we've kind of carved out where I give a presentation to the council after just about 4 weeks. And that's the entire budget for the entire county. And we haven't seen any of the prior discussions. So at the state level, they'll sit and be a part of kind of those meetings. And at the county level, that gets into the more, I guess, complicated relationship that is viewed as, Lori might need to correct me, but kind of the, I'm blanking on the term, but the process of making the decision. And then once the decision is made.
It's a different separation of powers. You know, the auditors considered the legislative branch, the budget comes down through the executive branch. So that's the auditor being part of the legislative branch evaluates on behalf of the legislative branch. So, and we'll get to that in Article 7 in a few nights or a few weeks.
Thank you. That's all that I have. Thank you for that explanation, by the way.
Great. Okay. So in this section, I mean, I kind of like where Mr. Snow was going with this. I guess I'm wondering, though, based on what you were just saying about your role in analyzing legislation and things, if there is, I mean, something in the charter that would be worth consideration from your perspective, or I mean, for a change to clarify that role, or
I mean, it seems I have not recently looked at a lot of the other local kind of counties in the area, but the idea that such a large portion of where our time goes is related to kind of these other duties as assigned seems like it could probably be clearer. There are also varying levels of responsibility. So right before I hopped on here, I was reviewing one of the Board of Education pieces of legislation, and this tends to get very complicated with the council. And sometimes I don't know if there would be a way for our role to be clear. We do not, as far as I understand, have the authority to do any type of performance audits for the Board of Education, but their legislation, their supplementary appropriations come through the county council. So we participate in that process from a budget and a legislation perspective, but really we're just kind of asking nicely and hoping that they give us information, which is a very odd role from my background as an auditor. To me, it's very clear when you're auditing what you do and don't have the right to access for. So it would be helpful for us to have some type of maybe more clear description of where those different roles kind of fall into place. Is that fair, Lori?
Yeah, and I did want to throw in, because I'm not sure you've mentioned this, but when the budget office does fiscal impact notes for legislation, and I guess part of what the auditor's office is kind of double check what the budget office says. You know, and I think it's true, if you look in the state kind of model, there is a fiscal impact note that goes with every piece of legislation. And that agency that does it might be a little more separated. In other words, their agencies are much more independent. So we have an executive branch and a legislative branch. We have one county. We don't have all these various independent agencies. So it is the legislative branch double checking on the executive branch that's kind of necessitated through the structure of government, I guess, more than anything. But there is a fiscal impact note that comes from the the executive branch. And I guess that's part of what your office does, is then kind of double check and go behind that and make sure that everything fits, matches, and that sort of thing.
And I think that it meets the needs, well, twofold. They only do it for administration bills. And then to make sure it meets the needs of the council, because they've definitely varied over my tenure. I've been in the office longer than I've been in this role in terms of the level of detail. So they kind of have a cleaner handoff if it comes to the council, whereas then if there are any remaining questions, we would be that avenue for that. Is that fair?
That's good. Mm-hmm.
And I guess maybe this is a question for Ms. Blair Klassmeyer. I guess if we raise some of these issues, it's about the role, and I guess I'll say expanding the role, but trying to give Ms. Blair some help in terms of these other duties as assigned by the council and things. I mean, that may not necessarily be something that needs to be in the charter, right? I mean, that's something that they could take up, and we could address the issue and suggest to be looked at more closely. And that's something they could then take up on their own to try to address that, correct? So, I mean, I guess I'm trying to feel out, do we really need a charter change for some of these things, or can we, if we raise the issues, could?
I'm looking at the Green Book before you answer real quick. And it says,
good for you.
I got it in front of me. It just discusses the auditor will make such investigation as the council may direct to make sure that officers, employees, contractors of the county faithfully discharge their public trusts. And it discusses I think that aspect of it. County executive is required to take appropriate action when the auditor brings irregularities to his attention. The auditor will also publish an annual audit. Further provision is made for such quadrennial audit by independent auditors for such special audits as the council may deem advisable. And those were just a few of the items that I think are discussed in the Green Book in regards to the county auditor's purpose, especially when we're just talking about in terms of like performance audits versus the fiscal audit, and making sure that there's such investigation as the council may direct. I think is where I'm trying to understand what might be charter worthy in regards to those audits. It's just a thought. Go ahead.
Well, I think the notion here is the difference between an auditor and an inspector general. I think that, that's been mentioned a couple times, that, the inspector general is somebody who kind of does more of the investigation of the actual actions and that sort of thing, whereas an auditor is looking at the financial records. And, maybe that's part of the issue. Maybe part of the issue is she needs 3 or 4 more employees.
Well, I don't want to derail the conversation with, I think that's probably
not from this group.
Message, right? But I do think we clarified within the charter kind of beyond just a financial auditor role or kind of an older interpretation of an audit role. So the current duties do reflect the ability to do performance audits. I think the only question I would have, and I don't know, so I don't know if this goes back to Ms. Blair Klausmeyer or someone on the commission, or this is kind of where you guys explore the other areas, but the section C, that is the power to assign additional duties, seems like it's grown so robustly that it may help to clarify kind of what that role is. Because I think when I was reading the resolution from 2015, it actually said to analyze fiscal impact and public policy. And that's all the guidance that we kind of have, except for the fact that it was done for, 40 years prior, and the SCBDs, they said 30 years prior. So I was like contacting my assistant county auditor to be like, did you know that we're supposed to do public policy? So to me, that may be an area where there could be help to have some clarification.
And let me just say, when she says
Thank you.
SCBDs, that includes special community benefit districts, shortage and controlled districts, and waterway improvement districts, of which there are now I think there's over 100 now, right? I mean,
It's a
total
lot.
categories. There are a lot, and those are community based. So you're dealing with community associations, people with different levels of ability and as far as dealing with these financial things. So I can only imagine. I mean, it's a lot number wise.
Well, and I think a lot of people, just to put context, they're very interested in creating one because then you can have the local government collect your essentially homeowners fees to do very specific purposes. And then they get very mad when we tell them all the things that they have to do related to oversight. And it's really not that bad, but it causes a lot of strife. Absolutely. And it just keeps growing. So those types of rules, I mean, we can go back to state law, which is what I've been trying to link to in terms of our procedures, but it's not, there's nothing in the county kind of charter to reflect that.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. Thank you. I think we can look at that. I know Mr. Snow, your hand is up. Go ahead.
No, I think that my question then for the commission would be, would we consider a reevaluation of that section C and perhaps ask the council, as far as a charter revision, and maybe this is a question for Ms. Klausmeyer, that the county examine the benefits of potentially creating or examining an inspector general role to address these things, so there's a clearer distinction of duties. Because I mean, I understand that, the duties are there, but I also understand that with the scope creeping, right, and with different areas of interest going in, people that are accountants and auditors, they're about the numbers, right? It's all about the numbers. It's about the data and the statistics and the analysis. From an efficiency standpoint, it feels like the only real remedy for this would be to make sure that there's a distinction of roles, and the county charter would need to address that. And again, using an old, antiquated definition of auditor, we're definitely within the point. And it's not like we don't have other jurisdictions that have taken this role. There's conversations in Baltimore County about how this is playing out. So yeah, I'm definitely open to at least maybe discussing further, recommending the addition of looking at that specific section and relegating that to a new role.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah, no, I think that sounds good. Yeah, I think maybe we can look at that more closely. I'm not sure if Ms. Blair Klausmeyer, we can look at it in the next couple of weeks, but if we can, consider some additional language, that would be great. Yeah, definitely to kind of clarify, section 311C, I think. And I think the Inspector General is something we could put out in a recommendation too. So thank you. Thank you for answering the questions and sticking with us so we understood. I think that makes perfect sense.
Great. Thank you for inviting me.
So, yes, I'm sure we'll be talking more. You want to make sure whatever we suggest works for you. So
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
It gets quite nuanced in the terminology for sure.
Yeah. Okay, so let's plan to take that up again at the next meeting. We have some time to actually think through what the language might look like, and we can discuss it in more detail then.
And I will talk to Ms. Bolair, and we'll, so I can understand exactly what she would like to see too. I mean, I think that would be helpful.
Okay, great. Sounds good. Thank you. All right. Let's see. Okay, so for Article 3 and for commission members, any other sections you would like to bring up for discussion at this point? All right, not seeing any hands or anything. I know we did have some citizen testimony that was also suggesting allowing for expedited ordinances in the place of a regular emergency. I think that's an item that we are already addressing, and we'll be looking at that in more detail at our next meeting. So I think we have addressed that. All right. I guess then that anything else on Articles 1, 2, or 3 before we jump to other business? All right, perfect. All right. I guess the first item under other business, and I just wanted to raise this because I know it came up at our last meeting, and that is dealing with a system for public campaign financing. As you probably all of you know, and I think really as Mr. Barron explained when he presented to us at the last meeting, there was legislation before the county council for this. It did need a supermajority, and this proposal was defeated. I think a part of the rationale or the in testimony against the resolution, or the, I'm sorry, the resolution, was that it's a charter amendment change, and there's a charter revision commission that's meeting right now. So I just wanted to put it out here, and I know there was some discussion, as I said, at the last meeting, and I wasn't sure if this was something that members would want to take back up for our discussion to recommend something to the council. Not suggesting one way or another. I just simply wanted to put it out there for discussion, since it was something that came up at the first meeting that we had. And Mr. Snow, I see your hand.
I mean, similar to our conversation about the districting, seeing as the legislation already failed, I see no reason to waste time on this.
Right, sounds good. Everyone else in agreement with that? We have another. I'll take silence as, okay, Mr. Kaufman?
I just want to state for the record, and I don't disagree with Mr. Snow's position on that. It makes sense that there's no need to engage in an exercise in futility, but $500,000 is a barrier for entry for public servants, and if you're having to spend $70,000 to $100,000 just to get elected for a position, that's also a barrier for entry for public service. And if we're going to be talking about part-time positions, and then at the same time talking about the cost to become a part-time politician, it's incongruent. They don't agree with each other. So the system is creating and promoting an environment where we are facilitating those with means and those with connections to be public servants. And I don't know that the Charter Revision Commission is necessarily the space that we can tackle that, but I believe that there needs to be discourse about how much money it costs for people to run for public service, and share the position that these should be part-time jobs.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kaufman. Mr.
I
Wise?
think that the Charter Revision Commission is definitely the place to discuss that. However, I don't think that, it's probably going to end up similar to how the amendment ended up. So it's in our political moment, I can't say that it's going to be worth the discussion, but it's definitely something that needs to be added to the discussion if in future Charter Revision Commissions. And hopefully in 10 years from now, we might have a different group of people that can make a decision that reflects the need for people that live in poverty to be able to actually be county council members, not just the wives of rich white men.
Oh, right. Thank you, Mr. Waddy. All right. Okay, let's see, moving on then. Doesn't seem like, I think that kind of really brings us, are there other items or other business the members would like to bring up at this time before we kind of talk where we are for our next meeting?
Just it was brought up last month, just to get kind of a little bit of a background on and we don't need to have it now, but for the next one, a little bit of background on the fire department, so that we can understand exactly why that subject was brought for us to consider.
Yep. Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's in the next article, I think. So yeah, I am looking at that. Yep.
So is our next meeting is February 28th, or is it March? Okay, February 28th, so in 2 weeks. Okay, so at that meeting, then we will be discussing Articles 4, 5, and 6. Article 4 is the county executive. Article 5 is the executive branch, and Article 6, the special boards, commissions, and committees. So in addition to the fire department things, are there any other items that members think they need or would like to have for their review of these three articles, the charter?
I would love to have a racial equity analysis of those aspects of the charter from Pete Hill. So if we could get that information from our Pete Barron to ask that, make that request of Pete Hill and possibly somebody from the Office of Law, then I would prefer to be able to have one of those done prior to the next meeting. And that's my request.
I guess I'm Ms. Blair Klassmar, do you have questions in terms of what Mr. Waddy means in terms of an equity analysis and what?
I'm guessing of what aspects, I guess, of the, so I can make sure I'm getting you the right information.
Which articles are we going over?
4, 5, and 6, I think, right?
Yeah,
Yes, yeah, the county executive, the executive branch, as well as special boards, commissions, and committees.
Um,
And if I heard correctly, we'll invite Pete Barron, but you would also like us to invite Pete Hill. Is that right?
that's right. Yes.
Okay. I can handle that part.
Okay.
And just for my own so Pete Hill, I guess, who is Pete Hill?
He's the director of, I may get these letters wrong, but diversity, equity, and inclusion. I may have them out of order, but that's his role.
Okay. Okay, that makes a little
The
more
county
sense now.
executive's office. Yeah, county executive
Okay.
office.
So I guess you're looking for something from Mr. Hill, I guess, Mr. Waddy, that's going to kind of give an overview or analysis of policies that are in place. We're looking at from the lens of diversity. And it's out his, I guess, his view of.
I'm looking for a diversity, equity, or racial equity, really is what I'm looking for. A racial equity analysis of the charter provisions that we're about to be discussing in regards to the executive branch. I mean, we can, I would love to be able to discuss with you further regarding that. But there's how the provisions in the charter affect whether or not they're racially they affect one race different than the other. You know, whether or not they're discriminatory, whether or not they have a positive benefit or not, whether or not they can be altered. That's my request. I definitely would like to talk with Pete further about that, though. But that's my request for this meeting.
Okay, thank you. All right, and I guess and Ms. Corby and Ms. Blair Klassmeyer, I guess once you reach out, if we need to talk about that further, if we can have a conversation offline to kind of.
I'm definitely available for that conversation. Thank you.
Okay.
So I think it might help me when I reach out to both the two Petes to understand if we are addressing Articles 4, 5, and 6 next time, which primarily deal with the executive branch. What specifically can we ask Mr. Hill to attend that relates to those articles? That might help me to give him a little, so he can prepare. We don't want to have a person come to take the time to attend who cannot answer your questions. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely makes sense. And again, I can't give you the specific provisions in this moment, so I don't have a problem, providing that information.
The other thing I'll note is that Article 8 deals with the personnel system. So I don't know if you're getting more towards that aspect of it as far as the workforce. I mean, I'm just throwing that out there.
No, that's definitely a great, idea in terms of having that opportunity brought before us as well. I think Pete's knowledge of government structure, Pete Hill's He's worked at the federal, and I think he's also worked at state government as well. He's worked within the executive branch on diversity, equity, inclusion issues, and can provide a pretty good analysis of how general provisions are, possibly, unintentionally discriminatory. So I think that that's kind of where I would like to hear a little bit more perspective from Pete Hill, and whether or not he views these different, because just like with the county auditor discussion, she started talking about performance audits. I know one of the things that has come up recently is these racial equity analysis of pieces of legislation coming out of the auditors' offices across the state. I think Montgomery County has one where there's a provision that they're required to have a racial equity analysis for each bill. And so that's more where my perspective is coming from, trying to hear from Mr. Hill whether or not he has a perspective on just the executive branch and possibly the boards and commissions, and whether or not they are, there's the volunteer nature of the boards and commissions affects the people who are poor and indigent in a way that it doesn't affect people who might not be. Whether or not the powers of the executive branch as written are contain racially discriminatory language that may not be, the word escapes me that I'm trying to recall, but it might not be expressed in what it is that we're reading. Might be in the underlying in the execution of it, as opposed to into the written language of it.
And maybe whether the structure of the executive branch through the charter is somehow a barrier to inclusion and diversity, something like that.
Yes, ma'am. That's exactly right.
Okay.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Waddy, for clarifying that. Yeah.
Thank you for asking.
Better understanding. Yep, that's great. Okay. All right. I think that brings us to the end of our agenda for this evening. Anything else from anyone else? Mr. Snow.
Sure. Just as a point of information, I will have a prior conflict for the next meeting, so I will not be present, barring extenuating circumstances.
Okay, great. I guess then I would just ask, I know we have a couple follow-up items where Ms. Blair Klassmeyer is going to work on some language, and I'm sure we'll probably have that a little before the meeting, probably, I'm guessing. So I guess if you have comments, please share them with us prior to the meeting then, so we can be sure we take those into consideration.
Thanks, we'll do.
Thanks. All right, guys, thank you. It's 9:30. We're a little bit early tonight. Hopefully you can maybe still have a quick Valentine's. I don't know. We'll see. My husband's probably sleeping on the couch upstairs, so we'll see. But anyway, but thanks. Have a great night. I'll see you soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.